On a cold morning in early 1944, deep along a forgotten stretch of the Western Front, an American anti-tank gun crew prepared for another day of uncertainty. Their 57 millimeters gun, weathered by months of mud, ice, and shifting lines, sat concealed behind a shallow rise overlooking a narrow road the Germans had used for night movements. Most days passed without incident, but on that morning, a single misjudged action by the gunner would alter the course of an unexpected encounter. Private First Class Edward Mallory had fired the weapon hundreds of times in training, and dozens more during the hard push through hedgerows and fortified villages. He was known in his battalion as a steady gunner, careful, consistent, methodical in a way that mattered when tanks could emerge with only seconds of warning. But fatigue had taken a toll. The men had barely slept during the previous nights, rotating watch shifts in freezing wind. Their field rations were low, and the constant dampness from melting frost pushed exhaustion into every decision. Shortly after dawn, as the crew scanned the tree for movement, Mallory took a shot he believed was the correct lead angle on a distant reconnaissance target. But a minor miscalculation, barely noticeable under normal conditions, sent the round striking a section of the road that seemed unimportant. The crew dismissed it as an inconsequential miss, the kind of error any gunner could make when cold and under pressure. Yet that stray impact triggered something no one expected. The shell struck a buried drainage pipe that had been weakened by days of rain. The explosion collapsed part of the road, not enough to block it entirely, but enough to create a shallow crater hidden by smoke and settling dust. Minutes later, a German Panzer group advanced along that same route, unaware that the path ahead had been altered. And within that small, unplanned disruption lay the narrow margin that saved Mallory's entire unit. The 57 millimeters anti-tank gun crew that Private First Class Edward Mallory served with had been forged through months of attrition and constant repositioning along the shifting Western Front. Their weapon, an American adaptation of the British six-pounder, was never the most powerful gun in the theater, but it was reliable, compact, and capable of stopping lighter German armor when placed in a favorable ambush position. Under the right conditions, and in the hands of a disciplined crew, it could still pose a threat to the more formidable Panzer IVs that roamed the front. Mallory's crew operated as a tightly knit team, each man's responsibilities overlapping instinctively after countless drills and real engagements. The gun commander, a hardened staff sergeant who had seen action in North Africa, understood that survival depended not on bravado but on discipline. The loader, quiet and methodical, worked with a practiced efficiency that rarely faltered even in the most stressful conditions. The rangefinder, positioned with binoculars behind an earthen berm, maintained constant vigilance. And Mallory, the gunner, served as the point where all their efforts converged. When the moment came, it was his sight picture, his calculations, and his steadiness that determined whether the first shot counted. By early 1944, their sector had settled into a pattern of intermittent movement and sudden bursts of violence. Snowmelt had turned the fields into mud that swallowed boots and wheels alike. Roads were reduced to narrow paths between deep ruts, and every low ridge or farmhouse could conceal a threat. The gun crew's position, dug into a shallow depression between tangled hedgerows, was selected for both concealment and necessity. It guarded a secondary route the Germans occasionally used when shifting supplies or probing American lines. Most days ended with nothing more than distant artillery echoing across the hills, or the faint grinding of engines too far away to pose immediate danger. But the crew understood that the quiet was deceptive. German armored units were practiced in exploiting gaps, and a single breakthrough on a neglected stretch of road could unravel an entire battalion position. The men lived with the discomforts that defined the winter campaign. Cold seeped through their gloves and uniforms, stiffening movements and slowing reactions. They relied on small fires built cautiously out of sight and on brief moments of rest snatched between shifts at the gun. Sleep came in fragmented intervals, broken by the need to scan the fog-covered fields or rotate watch positions. Their rations, already reduced by disrupted supply lines, added to the persistent weariness. For Mallory, the toll was less dramatic than cumulative. He had been steady through the hedgerow, fighting months earlier, relying on repetition and instinct to carry him through the tension of waiting for armored threats. But fatigue wore down even the most reliable gunners. The calculations that once came effortlessly, the adjustments for distance, wind, angle, and movement, now required a fraction more effort, particularly in the gray hours of dawn. The road they watched was little more than a narrow track with banks of frozen earth on either side. To the untrained eye, it appeared insignificant. But intelligence officers knew the Germans occasionally used it for nighttime resupply to nearby forward positions. That meant the gun crew had to be ready, even when nothing appeared for days at a time. On the morning of the miscalculation, Mallory's focus drifted slightly in the icy stillness. The cold bit at his knuckles as he settled behind the sight of the 57mm gun, adjusting the angle as the rangefinder called out distant movement, judged to be a small reconnaissance vehicle or possibly infantry on bicycles. It was not an immediate threat, but the crew remained cautious. Every unusual sound or shape along that road demanded scrutiny. Mallory exhaled slowly, aligning the reticle based on habit and muscle memory shaped by months of firing the weapon. But in the interplay of fatigue, cold, and imperfect visibility, his lead adjustment fell just short of the intended mark. The shot rang out, slicing through the morning stillness. A brief explosion marked where the round struck the road, not the intended target, but a few yards ahead of it. The crew dismissed it as a minor, inconsequential miss. They had no reason to suspect that the impact, buried beneath frost and mud, had already set in motion a series of events that would determine the fate of their entire sector. The hours following Mallory's miscalculated shot unfolded in the quiet, uneasy rhythm that defined many mornings on the Western Front. The sun rose reluctantly through a thin screen of low clouds, casting a pale, washed-out light across the mud-soaked fields. The trees stood bare and rigid under the lingering chill, their skeletal branches scratching at the wind. In that muted landscape, sound carried strangely. Distant artillery thumps drifted from far-off sectors, while the creak of supply wagons or scattered rifle fire echoed unevenly across the frozen ground. For the gun crew, the day's tasks resumed with the slow, deliberate repetition that war demanded. They checked the weapon's alignment, brushed frost from the firing mechanism, redistributed ammunition crates, and reinforced the thin earthen berm that shielded them from view. These routines served both practical and psychological purposes. They kept the men occupied and helped them maintain a sense of readiness against threats that might emerge without warning. The misfired shell left a faint smoke mark on the road, though the dust had long settled by the time Mallory reviewed the impact through his optic. The crater was small, barely noticeable at a distance, and seemed irrelevant given the absence of enemy movement. The drainage pipe beneath had been weakened by winter rains, but none of the men were aware of how the explosion had fractured the soil around it. The ground still held together enough to look unremarkable. What none of them knew was how precarious that section of road had become. The shell's blast had compromised the supporting soil under the frozen mud, creating a shallow depression that blended seamlessly into the landscape. Anyone glancing at it from afar would have seen nothing unusual, just a patch of disturbed earth on a narrow road. But its structural integrity had been broken. It would not collapse under a man's weight or even under light traffic. It needed something heavier, something tracked, something that exerted significant downward pressure, something like a Panzer. For now, The morning remained uneventful. The squadron's rangefinder scanned periodically through binoculars, eyes straining against the dull horizon. The loader stayed near the ammunition cases, shifting occasionally to restore circulation in his legs. The sergeant moved along the position, checking camouflage nets and adjusting branches that covered their gun's silhouette. Mallory, still unaware that his calculation error had any significance, cycled between monitoring the site and fighting off fatigue. Across the battlefield, German activity remained unusually quiet. The stillness suggested either an absence of movement or a concealed repositioning, both common patterns during the late winter months. German armored units often waited for low visibility conditions before launching reconnaissance thrusts or testing American responses along vulnerable stretches of the line. Local intelligence suggested the presence of a Panzer detachment somewhere beyond the tree line, but no one knew its exact strength or intentions. As the hours passed, the weather shifted again. A thin fog rose from the ground, curling through the hedgerows and pooling along the depressions between fields. For an anti-tank crew, fog could be both a blessing and a curse. It provided concealment from enemy observation, but it also reduced the chance of spotting armor before it closed within dangerous range. In the confined terrain of that sector, narrow roads, thick hedgerows, and rolling ground, visibility often dictated survival. From his position behind the gun, Mallory remained alert but increasingly weary. The combination of cold and inactivity pressed heavily on his concentration. He replayed the earlier shot in his mind, more out of routine than concern. His miscalculation was the kind of error that occurred in every unit, even among seasoned gunners. No one expected precision in the damp morning light. The shot had seemed irrelevant the moment it landed. Unseen to the crew, beyond the fog and tree line, a German armored element began its slow approach. Engines grumbled faintly, muffled by distance and terrain. Tracks churned through softened ground. The lead vehicles followed the narrow road that cut toward the American position, a route they believed safe, one they had used days earlier without incident. They moved steadily, unaware that the path ahead had been subtly altered by an American shell that was never meant to hit where it did. The quiet morning was drawing toward a confrontation none of the men at the 57mm gun anticipated, and their survival would hinge on a detail they still hadn't noticed. Beyond the thin line of trees that bordered the American sector, the German armored element continued its advance with the steady, deliberate rhythm characteristic of late war operations. The detachment consisted of several Panzer IVs accompanied by a handful of supporting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, a light half-track, and a small reconnaissance car that scouted the route ahead. They were not part of a major offensive. Rather, they were repositioning to reinforce a neighboring battalion after reports of increased American probing along the line. Such movements had become common as the German army attempted to stabilize its overextended fronts. The terrain offered limited mobility. Weeks of freezing temperatures followed by sudden thaws had softened the ground into a patchwork of mud and frost-hardened ridges. The road they followed, the same narrow route Mallory's crew watched, was one of the few passable paths for armored vehicles in the area. It wound between hedgerows and shallow ditches, bordered by farmland scarred by previous artillery fire. The Germans had used this track before, assessing it as reliable despite its poor condition. The route's familiarity gave them confidence, even though visibility ahead was increasingly obscured by fog. Inside the lead Panzer, the crew operated with the detached efficiency of men accustomed to the demands of armored warfare. The vehicle's engine rumbled with a deep mechanical growl, its tracks grinding mud and frost beneath heavy steel links. The commander surveyed the landscape through periscope slits, searching for any sign of American positions. But with the fog drifting low across the fields, the world beyond a few dozen yards remained indistinct. Any threat would emerge with little warning. The armored column advanced slowly, mindful of potential mines or anti-tank ambushes. The reconnaissance vehicle ahead reported no obstacles, no movement, and no unusual disturbances on the route. Their expectation was routine transit, perhaps minor resistance, but nothing beyond what they had experienced in the previous days. They trusted the road. They trusted the intel. And they trusted that the Americans were stretched thin across multiple sectors. What they did not know was that the ground beneath them had changed. Mallory's misplaced round had struck a weakness hidden under the frozen surface. An old drainage system patched hurriedly earlier in the winter, its structural integrity already compromised. The blast had fractured the soil, created voids beneath the hardened crust, and transformed a previously reliable section of road into a fragile shell. The weight of a Panzer IV, nearly 25 tons, was more than enough to trigger the collapse. As the lead tank approached the damaged section, its right track pressed hard against the weakened earth. The surface held for a moment, then gave way. The collapse was not catastrophic, but it was sudden, an abrupt downward shift that trapped the track in a shallow but unyielding depression. Mud and broken soil swallowed the lower rollers as the tank pitched slightly to one side. Instantly, the column's advance faltered. The second Panzer halted to avoid collision. The accompanying half-track swung to the side and stopped abruptly. The unexpected delay created confusion as the crews attempted to assess what had happened. Visibility conditions, combined with the assumption of a stable route, meant no one had anticipated ground failure. The lead vehicle was immobilized. Repairing or extracting a tank under battlefield conditions required time they did not have. Unaware of American observation, the Germans began to reorganize. The immobilized Panzer's turret traversed cautiously, scanning for threats while the crew evaluated their situation. Men from supporting vehicles approached on foot to inspect the damage, sinking slightly into the softened earth as they walked. The collapse appeared minor from above, just a shallow dip in the road, but it was enough to derail their movement and disrupt the timing of their transit. The pause stretched into minutes, and minutes on that morning were everything. Up on the ridge, Mallory and his crew saw the first outlines of armored shapes emerging through the fog. The unexpected halt had bunched the German vehicles together, compressing them into a tight formation directly within the gun's field of fire. None of them yet understood that the only reason the Panzers were stopped, vulnerable, exposed, and momentarily disorganized, was a misplaced shot Mallory had fired hours earlier. A mistake had become an opportunity, and the battle about to unfold would depend entirely on how they used it. The fog that had drifted across the low ground began to thin just as the German armored column stalled. From the vantage point of Mallory's 57mm gun crew, the outlines of the Panzer group sharpened into visible silhouettes, dark, angular forms pushing against the pale morning haze. What emerged was a scene no one had anticipated. A cluster of German vehicles halted in a confined section of the road, compressed together in a way that violated every principle of armored movement. Tank crews were trained to avoid bunching at all costs, especially near the front. Concentrated vehicles created easy targets for artillery and anti-tank weapons. Even brief halts usually spread out across cover or behind obstacles. Yet here, the Germans were huddled in an exposed bottleneck, with one Panzer immobilized in the shallow depression created by Mallory's earlier miscalculated shot. For the American anti-tank crew, it was a situation that should never have happened, an alignment of circumstance they could not have engineered even if they had planned it. From behind their concealed position, the Americans observed the German crews attempting to recover the immobilized tank. Soldiers dismounted, moving cautiously around the depression, probing the collapsed ground. The turret of the lead panzer rotated in slow arcs, its guns searching the hedgerows for signs of danger. The second panzer adjusted position slightly, angling its hull to cover the gap, but the tight road offered limited room for maneuver. Mallory understood the gravity of what he was seeing. The 57mm gun was not powerful enough to penetrate the frontal armor of a Panzer IV at long range, but from the side, and at close distance, its armor-piercing rounds could be devastating. The Germans, unknowingly, had turned their flanks toward the concealed American position. The immobilized tank's right side was exposed, its vulnerable road wheels and lower hull perfectly aligned within the gun's arc. The crew's training shifted instantly into focus. Range estimation, ammunition selection, and target priority became calculations of survival rather than routine. Mallory adjusted the elevation and traverse of the gun with steady, controlled movements. The mechanical squeak of the adjustment wheels muffled under layers of frozen mud. His earlier miscalculation, a moment of fatigue and distraction, had opened a window of opportunity. Now precision was critical. The gun commander assessed the scene through the narrow firing slit in their concealment. The German crews were still disorganized. Some clustered near the immobilized panzer. Others scanned the surrounding terrain without coordination. The second tank, while mobile, had not yet identified the American position. The fog had acted as a temporary veil, and by the time it lifted, the Germans were already compromised. To the American crew, this was the kind of fleeting moment that decided whether infantry lines held or shattered. A panzer group capable of breaking through their sector would threaten not just their platoon, but the entire battalion's flank. The 57mm was a weapon designed for moments like this. Quick, decisive action before the enemy regained momentum. Mallory took aim. From their position, the distance was optimal. The side armor of the immobilized panzer was exposed at precisely the angle anti-tank crews trained for. The gunner's reticle settled over the weakest point of the vehicle's profile, an area near the lower hull, where a well-placed round could cripple the tank entirely. The loader prepared the next round, his movements silent and automatic. The rangefinder adjusted his vantage point slightly, verifying that no additional German vehicles were approaching from the rear. The breathless stillness in their shallow dugout was broken only by the faint wind brushing the hedgerows. Mallory exhaled slowly, replicating the steady rhythm that had guided him through countless drills. The misjudgment that had started this chain of events was gone from his mind. Now, there was only the sight picture, the alignment of target and barrel, and the knowledge that their survival depended on what happened next. He fired. The recoil of the 57mm gun kicked sharply into the frozen earth, its report echoing across the fields in a sudden burst of violence. The shot struck the immobilized panzer squarely, detonating against its compromised side armor. Smoke erupted from the vehicle as its track and road wheels buckled under the force. Instantly, the German column erupted into motion, chaotic, uncoordinated, and too late. What unfolded next was the result of a mistake that had become an ambush, and Mallory's crew now faced the full response of a surprise panzer group. The moment Mallory's round struck the immobilized panzer, the battlefield transformed. What had been a quiet, fog-draped road became a narrow arena of sudden violence. Smoke seeped from the immobilized tank's flank, curling upward as the crew scrambled inside to assess the damage. The second panzer, now aware of the threat, jolted into action, its turret jerking toward the hedgerows in search of the hidden gun. Every second counted, yet the Americans had seized the initiative and the Germans were struggling to understand what had hit them. The 57mm gun crew moved with the sharp precision forged through months of drill and combat. The loader seized another armor-piercing round, his hands thawed not by warmth but by adrenaline. The commander evaluated the shifting scene, noting the positions of the vehicles and the likelihood of immediate return fire. Mallory focused on the reticle, already adjusting for a second shot. Their ambush position, carefully chosen weeks earlier, now proved its worth. The hedgerow concealed their outline, and the shallow depression in which their gun was dug protected them from anything but a direct hit. The German response was hindered by their own formation. With the lead tank disabled and blocking the road, the remaining vehicles had limited room to maneuver. The 2nd Panzer attempted to swing its hull into a firing position, but the cramped track prevented a clean angle. Its exposed side armor, vulnerable but still dangerous, rotated slowly as the turret struggled to acquire a target hidden deep in camouflage. Mallory fired again. The second round struck closer to the immobilized tank's turret ring, fracturing structural casing and sending fragments across the roadside. The Germans responded with a burst of machine gun fire, raking the hedgerows in an attempt to suppress the unseen gun. Bullets cut through branches and churned frost, but the American crew remained sheltered behind their earthen berm. Moments later, the 2nd Panzer managed to free enough space to reverse slightly, attempting to angle its armor toward the threat. But in doing so, it exposed its forward right corner, an angle where the 57mm gun's penetration was marginal, yet potentially effective at close enough range. The gun crew recognized this split-second vulnerability. Mallory corrected his aim once more. The third shot thundered through the air. The round grazed the track of the 2nd tank, severing one of the forward links. Sparks erupted as steel collided with steel, and the Panzer lurched violently. Without its full track, its maneuvering ability collapsed. The vehicle ground to a halt, struggling in a cloud of churned mud and smoke. In a matter of seconds, 2 tanks that posed a mortal threat to the American position had been neutralized, not destroyed outright, but immobilized and locked in place, unable to advance or retreat. Their vulnerability rippled through the rest of the column. The remaining vehicles, light armored carriers and support troops, were suddenly stranded behind 2 disabled panzers. Their ability to respond was fragmented, and their line of fire obstructed. The Germans attempted to dismount infantry under the cover of armored hulls, seeking to flank the American position. But the narrowness of the road and the rising confusion prevented coordinated movement. Each attempt to organize a counterattack faltered against the constricted terrain and the fear of additional unseen threats. To them, the American ambush seemed deliberate, timed, calculated, and expertly prepared. In truth, it was none of those things. It had been shaped entirely by Mallory's first mistake. The misfired round that struck the hidden drainage pipe created the initial weakness that trapped the lead panzer. That immobilization bunched the German vehicles together, exposing their flanks to the 57mm gun. And the delay forced the column to halt in the worst possible place, directly within Mallory's field of fire, at the exact moment his crew was at full readiness. Within minutes, the German armored element retreated the only direction left, back along the road. The surviving vehicles reversed hastily, leaving the immobilized tanks behind. The American crew watched as the fog reclaimed the road, and the sound of engines faded into the winter landscape. The threat was gone. The line held, and the company's flank remained intact. Later that day, after the area was secured, Mallory examined the crater again. The truth became clear. The single miscalculation, one he had dismissed as fatigue and error, was the reason the road collapsed at the precise moment a panzer rolled over it. It had been an accident, but it saved them all. In the official battalion report filed that evening, the encounter on the narrow road was described in simple, factual terms. A German armor detachment attempted a local advance. 2 tanks were disabled, and the attack was repelled without American losses. Nothing in the report captured the chain of events that had made this outcome possible. There is no mention of the misplaced shot, the weakened roadbed, or the accidental timing that had placed the Panzer column squarely in Mallory's sights. The written record, like so many from the war, reduced a complex moment to a line of concise military language. Yet the reality behind that brief entry was far more fragile and human. War often hinges on precision, on well-executed plans, accurate firing, coordinated movement, and decisions made under pressure. But it also turns on the unpredictable, the weather, the terrain, the timing of a patrol, or the fatigue of a single soldier making a calculation under cold, dim morning light. Mallory's initial error did not reflect poor training or lack of skill. It reflected the strain carried by thousands of men across the front, exhaustion, hunger, and the grinding uncertainty of prolonged combat. Had his round flown a few yards farther or a few inches higher, the outcome would have been entirely different. The German armored element would have reached the American flank at full strength, capable of breaking through thin defensive lines and threatening the battalion's entire position. The short engagement that followed could easily have reversed. A different angle, a clearer road, or a single German shell finding its mark would have changed the story from a defensive success into a costly retreat. But fate in war rarely follows clean lines. Mallory never considered himself a hero. His crew credited discipline, training, and the advantage of concealment. None of them embraced the idea that survival had emerged from an error. But in the quiet moments after the engagement, when the smoke settled and the fields regained their winter stillness, the truth lingered in the minds of those who understood how close they had come to disaster. A single miscalculated shot weakened a road. A weakened road halted a tank. A halted tank blocked an entire column. And the delay placed the Panzers exactly where the 57mm gun could stop them. In the vast scale of the Second World War, such details disappear beneath the weight of larger histories. But for the men who lived through these moments, they defined the thin boundary between loss and survival. On that cold morning in early 1944, a gunner's small mistake became the narrow margin that saved his entire unit. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.